Got.
Okay, here we go. I think this is like session 9 or something like that. And it's the 18th of August, 2021. And we are on page 34. Page 34. Any old business that anyone wants to bring up before we dive in? Doesn't sound like it. Okay. William is now seated, comfortable. Looks like he's ready to go. All right. Bill is getting situated on the front porch, looking out at the lake. We're all jealous, envious.
Mosquitoes chase me in, so don't be too envious.
All right. Let's start on page 34. I know we're backing up just a little bit, but I want to get a running start on this. So, Frank, second full paragraph.
It is in solitude that this compassionate solidarity grows. In solitude, we realize that nothing human is alien to us, that the roots of all conflict, war, injustice, cruelty, hatred, jealousy, and envy are deeply anchored in our own heart. In solitude, our heart of stone can be turned into a heart of flesh, a rebellious heart into a contrite heart, and a closed heart into a heart that can open itself to all suffering people in a gesture of solidarity. If you would ask the Desert Fathers why solitude gives birth to compassion, they would say, because it makes us die to our neighbor. At first, this answer seems quite disturbing to a modern mind, but when we give it a closer look, we can see that in order to be of service to others, we have to die to them. That is, we have to give up measuring our meaning and value with the yardstick of others. To die to our neighbors means to stop judging them, to stop evaluating them, and thus to become free to be compassionate. Compassion can never coexist with judgment because judgment creates the distance, the distinction, which prevents us from really being with the other.
Okay, so we've got this idea of dying to our neighbor. And this is a motif that runs through the New Testament. Jesus is always talking about it. Paul talks about it, you know, the old man dying. Jesus talks about picking up our cross daily and following him. If we want to find our life, we have to lose it. He is talking about dying to our neighbors means to stop judging them, to stop evaluating them, and thus become free to be compassionate. There is this motif that runs through of dying. So we've got Jonah going into the belly of the whale. We've got Jesus going into the tomb. We've got Noah going into the belly of the ark. All of these descents, these enclosures, these tomb-like enclosures before an opening up, a regeneration, right? And so we've got this motif. It's the descent before the ascent, the Paschal mystery, those things we talk about. But if you really think about it, you know, dying to the neighbor is really dying to the illusion of the separate self, this egoic self, this mind that talks to us. It always is creating the sensation that we are separate from and in competition with each other. But dying to that illusion, I think, is really what he's talking about here, what the scriptures are talking about here, and being able to see the truth. But we can't do that when we are identified with our egoic minds, which is what we naturally do. I use the analogy, I think it was in the Fifth Way, maybe it was in the other one, of the idea of the stars after dawn are still right where they were when the sky was dark. They haven't moved. They're in the exact same place. The only difference is that this big nearby star has risen above the horizon and scattered the high intensity light in such a way that a curtain has come down and we can't see the stars behind. But if we wait long enough, that big star, that near star, will set, and then we'll be able to see what has been right in front of us all the time. If you want to think of your consciousness, your egoic mind as that nearby star, the sun. As long as it's risen, as long as it's in the sky, as long as you're identified with it, you can't see what's literally right in front of your face. But if we learn through contemplation to set that sun, then we see what's right in front of us again. It's kind of like that idea of dying to self. I mean, the ancients understood the sun is dying every night and then being reborn every morning. So we've got that kind of motif going. If we can learn to set the sun of our own consciousness, then we can see what's right in front of us. We can see the truth. And what's the truth? Well, the truth is that we are all connected. We're all one. The way we treat others is literally the way we're treating ourselves. And so that connection becomes clear. And then in the glare of that truth, I guess if we want to look at it that way, then we become free to be compassionate because we're no longer judging them. Judging equals the separation. Judging is the objectifying of another thing or person, creating categories and separating them out. All of that dissipates when we see the truth of our oneness. But we've got to be able to set that sun. And that's the key. How do we do that? Well, that's what Jesus' way is all about. And Jesus' way is a contemplative way. It's that way of negation. It's that way of descent before the ascent on the other side. Any of this helping? Any of this making sense?
Yes,
Thank you, Scott.
you're welcome. Sorry to be so long-winded.
That's all right. Okay. Any further comment needed? Or do we turn Frank loose again? All right, go ahead, Frank. Another paragraph.
Much of our ministry is pervaded with judgments. Quite often unconsciously, we classify our people as very good, good, neutral, bad, and very bad. These judgments influence deeply the thoughts, words, and actions of our ministry. Before we know it, we fall into the trap of the self-fulfilling prophecy. Those whom we consider lazy, indifferent, hostile, or obnoxious, we treat as such, forcing them in this way to live up to our own views. And so much of our ministry is limited by the snares of our own judgments. These self-created limits prevent us from being available to people and shrivel up our compassion.
So remember, we're talking, this whole chapter is about solitude. And solitude is the engine of compassion, according to Nouwen, according to the Desert Fathers and Mothers. It's in solitude that we find the wherewithal to be compassionate, because it's in solitude that we learn to set the sun of our consciousness. It's in solitude that we learn to stop judging because we see the truth. And so, again, we can be talking about liminality here, that ability to stay on the threshold. We can be talking humility. All of these qualities are contained in this idea of dying to our neighbors, dying to self. But this is where the work comes in. I think this is where Paul talks about working out your salvation in fear and trembling comes in. And if we want to distinguish that from salvation by calling it sanctification, so be it. But this is the work. If we are going to be able to experience what Jesus calls kingdom in our life, experience that sensation of seeing life through the Father's eyes, then this is the work that needs to be done. We've got to work through the identification with the egoic mind that causes all the compulsions and compulsive actions and thought patterns and everything else that goes on in our normal lives. So this is the work. This is what we're talking about. And solitude helps us do that. Actually, all four of the S's, silence, solitude, stillness, simplicity, is all part of the desert experience.
David made me think of I was watching a talk with Richard Rohr the other day, and he was talking about just the use of language, the use of words. Like, words create duality. Like, soon as we define something as whatever, it's no longer something else.
Mm-hmm.
And just thinking about the previous paragraph about our judgments that are creating distinctions, and this paragraph just reminded me of just the importance of silence. Like, getting to that place where we don't have any words to attach is, I just thought that was a good thought.
Yeah. Right on. And that's a great point that Roar made. You know, as soon as we put something into words, we've created a duality. It is this, it isn't that. We are here, the object is there. So it separates subject from object. It separates this from that. So words do that by necessity. That's what they're supposed to do. They need to create the edges so we can hold on to it, you know, and we can understand it as being this from that. It's separate from its background. We have to do that in order to get through daily life. But we need to also realize that all of that is just a tool for us to be able to survive and navigate this life, but it's not the expression of deepest reality. You know, the deeper reality is that it's all one.
Dave,
Yeah.
as I read this, it sounds to me like he's like this movement into compassion happens almost organically out of solitude. But can't it also be a decision that we can catch ourselves in egoic mind or in judgment and make a decision to move into compassion?
Yeah, I'm sure. Yes, absolutely. We're making a decision to be in solitude. We can make a decision to be compassionate, but I think they're both coming from the same place. True compassion is feeling the oneness with the beloved, with the other, to such an extent that, you know, we're treating them as we would treat ourselves because they're an extension of ourselves. So once again, it's that stripping away of everything that tends to separate us and the judging mind that is always categorizing and creating distinctions. When all that kind of fades away and we're just there with the other, then what naturally flows is compassion. But I suppose you can intentionally approach compassion the same way you would intentionally approach solitude. But how do you get to the point where you are really living your life without that tight identification with your egoic mind, with your consciousness? That's a process. I was talking to a couple of the staff at the hospital in the emergency department. I've been going shifts in the hospital and talking to them, and a couple of them, an EMT and one of the physicians, I was talking to them about, you know, mindfulness. How often are you really present, and how often is your consciousness and your mind apart from the task at hand? And they both said that when they're on shift, the EMT said 90% of the time, I am completely present and I'm completely aware. And the physician said, she didn't attach a number to it, but she said, yes, there's no time to think about anything other than what I'm doing when I'm on shift in the emergency department. And I get that. But then they said, when I go home, then my mind's all over the place. You know, I can't even sit and watch TV and stay focused on it, you know, and I'm all over. So it's the intensity of the situation that they're in during their shift that just displaces all the other thoughts. And they're just focused on what they're doing. But you remove the intensity from the moment, and then their thoughts are just scattered and all over the place. And so what we're trying to do is to train ourselves that this is the basic reality of life. That's this oneness. And we can experience that in a seamless way, not just when the situation is intense enough. And so I think there's still got to be an intentionality toward that setting of the consciousness, which requires silence and solitude and stillness. And so there may be certain instances, you know, where the situation is such that we can naturally go there. But I think if it's an overall characteristic of us, then I think that is something that takes a little bit more time and practice. Am I even in the ballpark of what you're talking about, Becky? Okay.
I'm thinking of Ken Wilber, and I'm not going to get his words right. It's been a long time since I read him. But it's the idea of what I would call the observer, that the observer is our deepest self.
Mm-hmm.
And so as the observer, if I'm more in the position of the observer, which I would think would happen more with meditation or with solitude, also that position would become stronger. I can recognize almost like a weather system, whatever I'm feeling or whatever I'm thinking or the judgment, and not take it on. Yes, or like, yeah, okay.
Yeah, the observer, the watcher, that deeper self is what is left when we step away from the conscious mind. In meditation, in centering prayer, in solitude, in silence, when we're not using words anymore. I love the description of the sensory walk. Is like you take the walk and you're noticing things, but you don't name them. You don't put a word to it. You don't put a name to it. You just notice shapes and colors and composition, but you're not thinking about the thought. You're not thinking about the thing. And that keeps you in that non-dual space. And spending enough time there, I think, breaks the connection, the stranglehold that our egoic minds have on us and our identity. And then we're able to realize that, yes, I have this egoic mind. It is a tool of mine. It carries along everything that means for me to be a person as a human, but it's still not who I really am. And who I really am is connected and one with. And I think that kind of juxtaposition of these unseen and seen worlds creates a different experience. And don't get me wrong. It's not like I'm there all the time in some kind of great mystical sense, but I've experienced it and I know what it feels like. And
David, could I
Yeah,
share
go ahead,
a
John.
quick example? Trish and I have been watching a TV show you may have heard of called Twin Peaks. And we're watching Twin Peaks: The Return, and the director is David Lynch, who I've enjoyed. And Lynch is into meditation, and a lot of the scenes in his film are very slow. I mean, it's almost like watching paint dry when you watch his film. And I think it'd be very hard to watch the film, his work, unless you were meditating at the same time, or if you were used to, if you could only really enjoy his films if you've got a routine, steady practice of meditation. So I went to the doctor's office for my eyes. They double checked and then they dilated my eyes. And I'm suddenly walking out of the doctor's clinic, and I look in the elevator and the lights all have like a little halo around them. And I felt like I was in a David Lynch film because the down arrow, the little green down arrow was blinking. And I was just staring at that like a baby, looking at that for the first time ever with fresh eyes about how that arrow was showing the direction this whole unit would be moving in. And it was just kind of, to me, it crystallized everything about, the benefits of meditation, that it gives you that connection with reality that, you wouldn't normally have.
That's great, John.
Hello, Bob.
Oh, man.
I was thinking about Becky's comment or Becky's question about whether the compassionate part needs to be intentional. I guess, I don't know, maybe Dave, you already said this, but I guess to some degree, anyone who is going to spend time meditating is probably going to be leaning towards compassion already. But I think this idea of like getting rid of the words and just clearing the words away, the judgments has to go with the words. And my experience is, like, I like that last sentence in the previous paragraph there. Compassion can never coexist with judgment because judgment creates the distance. So once you do this contemplative practice and you just sit in that space, once the judgments are removed, then the compassion just takes its place, I suppose.
Yeah, that's pretty good. I like that.
I mean, would you say in my mind, all those things are already innate in us since we're made in the image and likeness of God? I think it's not so much that we develop compassion as we develop that oneness, and that connection with God allows that true self of ours that already has compassion. I think we're all created with compassion and kindness and mercy. It just gets overtaken by that egoic mind. And like you're saying, you know, I was thinking just a moment ago about all the years I practiced martial arts. You would constantly show up to the dojo and you would constantly train techniques and concepts, and over however much time, because you keep going back and you keep practicing and practicing, suddenly it's natural. You know, there's an awareness of so much more around you. You know, in a martial arts sense, you sense when a punch is coming, whereas if you hadn't shown up and kept practicing, you probably would have never got to that point of oneness, so to speak. You know, and I kind of see it that way, that if we just keep showing up and we keep practicing and practicing, at some point, this natural awareness is going to overtake us just because we've been showing up and practicing.
I think that's right on, Mike. Absolutely. You know, we always talk about the spiritual life being more about subtraction than addition. What we're trying to do is subtract all those things that have been, you know, accrued over our lifetimes, that are laid upon that inner self. And so we need to strip that back off again. And the way we do it is with solitude and silence and stillness and simplicity, by allowing things to fall back off again so we can get back to the innate self. And I think, you know, William can probably reduce this back to Enneagram numbers, but I think there are some of us who are just more naturally suited to this. I mean, empaths and people who are intuitives, they don't think in words as much. I mean, I am so word-based, it's scary. If you could step inside my head and just hear the words going on. You know, maybe it's the teacher in me, because as soon as I think of something, I'm immediately breaking it down and how I'm going to communicate it to somebody. And then all of a sudden I realize I am never going to talk about this to anybody ever. Why am I spending all this time thinking about it and trying to figure this out? And I try to put it away. But I think there's other people that just naturally are just making those intuitive leaps, and they're just naturally more wordless. And I think they're naturally more compassionate at the same time. There's that connection that they feel. You know, Marion is like that. She walks into a room, she feels the room, and she's telling me about things, and I'm saying, what? You know, I will plod along and finally get to the place that she got immediately. Now, the difference is I can tell you how I got there and every step along the way, because I had to take all those steps. She just goes there. And I think there's people like that too. So I think for some of us, this is going to be a lot harder than for others. And just the way it is.
Dave, don't you think it has to do with stage of life a little bit as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
The
The more that we've suffered, the more that we've been through. Yeah.
That, as well as, you know, what stage of life we are with, whether we have family or a certain job that has an intensity to it that gets your wheels moving. And, you know, raising kids, I mean, I'm around my nieces and nephews here. I mean, they're in the middle of, you know, 4 girls under the age of 10, right? I mean, for them to be intentional and they have to actually add a habit of carving the time into their schedule, because otherwise it's overtaken by 4 little beautiful girls. Whereas when you're done with work, you raised your family, you're sort of retired, getting toward that last season of life, we can be more reflective and take the time to do it, but it still takes, for me anyway, a decision to incorporate the habit of quieting myself. If I don't do that, there's plenty of other things to do. So stage of life seems to me to have a big influence on this.
I think the older we get, the more life puts in silence and solitude and stillness and simplicity, because a lot of things are being taken away, subtracted out. You know, like you said, all young children and all the things that create all the beautiful noise in our homes. The nest empties out and you're left with much more silence. and you're not able to do all the things that you used to do. You don't even have maybe the inkling to want to do the things you used to do, but there's a lot more stillness. But you can power through and remain just as active mentally as you want for as long as you want. But I think life starts to provide us in the second half more of the circumstances and elements that are conducive to being able to get to this place, certainly. Okay, let's read a little more.
Do not judge, and you will not be judged yourselves, is a word of Jesus that is indeed very hard to live up to, but it contains the secret of a compassionate ministry. This becomes clear in many stories from the desert. Abba Moses, one of St. Anthony's followers, said to a brother, "To die to one's neighbor is this, to bear your own faults and not to pay attention to anyone else wondering whether they are good or bad. Do no harm to anyone. Do not think anything bad in your heart towards anyone. Do not scorn the man who does evil. Do not put confidence in him who does wrong to his neighbor. Do not rejoice with him who injures his neighbor. Do not have hostile feelings toward anyone, and do not let dislike dominate your heart." And with the typically graphic imagery of the desert, everything is summarized with the words, "It is folly for a man who has a dead person in his house to leave him there and go to weep over his neighbor's dead."
Did that last saying make sense to you?
No.
It's folly for a man who has a dead person in his house to leave him there and go to weep over his neighbor's dead. I love that.
It is, that's awesome.
Yeah, if you connect that to everything he said before, basically he's getting to the same place where Jesus was saying, hey, why are you working to take the speck out of your brother's eye when you got a log in your own eye? You hypocrite, take the log out of your own eye so you can see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. Same thing here, but maybe even a little bit more colorful and interesting. But that's the idea. Why are we going out there and working with something out there when it has to start here? That idea of fighting the interior or internal revolution first before we fight the other one. You know, when your eye is single, when it's clear, when it's true, when it's sincere, then your whole body is full of light. Your whole body is full of harmony and order and illumination. But if the eye is bisha, if it's unripe, if it's immature, if it's not able to do what it's designed to do, then your body is full of darkness, hoshecha, which means chaos, disorder. So it's the same ideas that are being transmitted to us over and over again, that the work starts interiorly. We have to do this work or we're not going to be able to help anybody else. And that's the other thing that we were talking about, you know, these men and women who went off to the desert, it sounds kind of selfish. It sounds kind of you know, cloistered and all of that. But really, they were doing it in order to be of service. And they realized the only way they could be of service is if they cleared up the inside first. If they figured out what it meant to be who they were authentically, then they could turn and help another. But that was the order of things. And these sayings, as we get into more of them, I think you're just going to love them. The brevity, the even the humor and the clarity of them is striking. Okay, continue on, Frank.
Solitude leads to the awareness of the dead person in our own house and keeps us from making judgments about other people's sins. In this way, real forgiveness becomes possible. The following desert story offers a good illustration. A brother committed a fault. A council was called to which Abba Moses was invited, but he refused to go to it. Then the priest sent someone to say to him, "Come, for everyone is waiting for you." So he got up and went. He took a leaking jug, filled it with water, and carried it with him. The others came out to meet him and said to him, "What is this, Father?" The old man said to them, My sins run out behind me, and I do not see them. And today I am coming to judge the error of another. When they heard that, they said no more to the brother, but forgave him.
Keep going.
What becomes visible here is that solitude molds self-righteous people into gentle, caring, forgiving persons who are so deeply convinced of their own great sinfulness and so fully aware of God's even greater mercy that their life itself becomes ministry. In such a ministry, there is hardly any difference left between doing and being. When we are filled with God's merciful presence, we can do nothing other than minister, because our whole being witnesses to the light that has come into the darkness. Here are two desert stories that show this tender, compassionate ministry.
Okay, before you go into the stories, some of this is actually speaking to Becky's comment earlier, I think, or the question, in such a ministry, there's hardly any difference left between doing and being. When we're filled with God's merciful presence, we can do nothing other than minister because our whole being witnesses to the light. And I think that's the idea. We worry about a lot of things. There's a lot of details that we're trying to fix, to transform. It's almost like that whack-a-mole game where you're pounding down this one thing that pops up and then it's popping up everywhere, and you're just constantly working this thing like crazy, trying to beat down all of these things that you're trying to fix in your life. But if we can back up, instead of dealing with the tributaries in the river, if we just back up to the headwaters, then there's just one thing that we need to deal with. And if we can deal with that one thing, then it's going to deal with all the tributaries and all the other things and details as they move on through. And that one thing is solitude. It's getting silent and alone enough that we can start to experience who we really are. And we can only experience who we really are in relation to ultimate reality, who God really is. When we start to experience that quality of presence and realize we're attached to it, we're part of it, we came from it, we're part of it now, we're returning to it, then I think everything starts to change from the inside out. And that's where the compassion does naturally flow from the oneness that we are beginning to understand is the basis of things. And all those details, we don't have to whack the moles anymore. They're gonna quiet on their own. We just have to show up to the one thing, kind of like Michael was saying. You just show up to the dojo and do the moves, do the routines. A lot of things are going to happen. If you show up to your meditational sit, you show up to your centering prayer sit, you don't have to think about all the things that are happening. They will happen over time as you just keep showing up, and that greater awareness will start to present itself. And a lot of the things that we fret over kind of take care of themselves in a way. Not fully, but it begins to flow more organically. And so I don't know that you don't need to start from a meditational point of view. You can start from a relational point of view, but I think the same thing is going to happen. There's going to be that sense of that inner being that is not touched by all of the craziness that the egoic mind is trying to process every moment of every day.
Yeah, a friend of mine went away on a silent retreat, and she told me somewhere around day 5 or 6, she just went completely crazy. Like she couldn't stop the voice in her head. And she had a mini breakdown where she started crying uncontrollably, and somebody had to console her. One of the people who was part of the retreat had to console her and bring her back together. But just not having another person there as a distraction, or just somebody to help to formulate your thoughts, like a lot of times we don't know how to really describe it, but you're constantly thinking, and our thinking is governed by context more than we realize. And having all of that context just removed, and all that's left is the thoughts, she said it was the scariest thing she's ever done in her life and the most rewarding thing she's done. And yeah, so I like what he's saying here, and this is the first time that experience makes sense to me that my friend described.
Oh, really? That's great.
Yeah.
You know, Merton
What
talks
made it?
about that too, that the people who went out into the desert for any other reason than the purity of just trying to find God's presence could go literally mad. Kind of the thing you're describing here, William, about your friend. They'd freak out. They'd have some kind of episode because, yeah, if you're still trying to process everything through the egoic mind and you lose that context, the way you put it, that doesn't compute. I'm sorry, Mike, I cut you off.
Oh, William, I was going to ask you, what was,
Oh, Bill.
you said that it ended as it was the best thing of her life too. What was it about it that made it the best thing?
Well, I think what it brought to mind was she left there with an awareness that there was this running narrative that she was dealing with. It was still there, but now it was like, there's my thinking self, doing what it does. And, realizing as well, and I think this thought here about judgments is really profound, because she would have these moments of pushing back against people that, got, created some friction, and came to the realization when she was in silence that she was creating her own friction, even by herself, without anybody around her. And I have been catching myself doing that, being home here. Like, I have these moments where I'm picking a fight in my head and I'm winning the fight because I'm saying all the right things. And it's all just judgment on judgment on judgment on judgment. And it's just my own shit, and yeah, I can totally see how it can be a transformative experience. Just having a highlight of what you're bringing to the table that's independent of anyone else, has to be transformative, I think.
So William, I was just thinking, I'm thinking about somebody that maybe struggles with maybe depression, and then I again, I'm not an expert on depression, but it seems like that might not be the right kind of situation for somebody, because I think we've always said that comment, Dave, in the past, that sometimes being in your head is a dangerous neighborhood. So if somebody is in the wrong shape or of their mind, maybe being alone for long periods of time is not the right answer necessarily, because they can perhaps get spun in the wrong direction. And I think sometimes they may lose, I think I need somebody else to check me on this. I've got to have someone to bounce this off of, or else I'm just spinning here. And so, when does it become dangerous to be in your own mind and then not be able to get out of that spiral? Maybe, and I mean, maybe that's a whole nother topic, I don't know, but I'm sure people that went off into the desert, they may have had depressive moments or feelings, and hopefully they're shoring each other up some way. But I don't know.
I think you're raising a good point there. I mean, when we get depressed, we isolate,
right,
a lot of times. And yeah, it might not be the direction you want to go in. Well, it will be painful, but I wouldn't say it would be the wrong direction necessarily.
Okay.
Maybe they need to have a little bit of a break.
Well, and it's a good question. Is meditation a good thing for someone that deals with depression? Maybe it is a good, healthy thing if they know what they're doing, if they practiced it, if they continue to show up to that, if they have a routine, perhaps. I don't know, but maybe so.
This is important, because this is the role of a spiritual director as well, and the role of a therapist as well. And you peel back a few layers and you could be in for a world of hurt, in the sense that it's going to get worse before it gets better. And you need to have someone there that's going to help you. I see Becky nodding her head, and I'm sure you all clinicians have experienced this. I know people talking to me about EMDR. I mean, you get into those traumatic experiences and try to relive those again, and it can stir up a whole bunch of stuff off the bottom of the aquarium. And what do you do with all that material? That's why it's important to have someone. These first pioneers that went out, they were on their own. But after that, they were establishing even communities of hermits. And so they had the elders. So you always see in these stories, there's an elder with the acolyte. They're working together in pairs because they need that for exactly the reason you're talking about, Kathy. And it would be important to have that because you don't, when you're first starting out, you don't necessarily know what all this stuff is. And you just know that suddenly you're starting to feel all this agitation and all this stuff is coming to mind, but what do you do with it? And that's where it's good to have somebody there.
I mean, for myself, I've had chronic depression for 40 years. And I know when you go into that dark zone, which you just never really know when that's going to take place, you can really spiral being alone. I mean, your egoic self is just hounding you. But I find, especially as I get older, if I can just grab onto, like your terminology, Dave, that stake in the ground and make that reconnection with the Father, I seem to be able to come out of those spins a lot quicker and find centering again. You know, sometimes it's a little difficult to get to that place of reconnection, but it's definitely doable. And I don't know, you know, a lot of people that suffer depression, I think it's a little different for each of us. You know, there are definite, you know, whether it's a chemical imbalance or I think there's also emotional and spiritual, physical. I think there's a lot of that plays into depression. But if you can just make that connection again back to the source of love and that stake in the ground, we fare much better. At least I do myself.
Mm-hmm. And there's the idea that, you know, solitude isn't being alone. Solitude in this sense is being alone with God. So being alone with the presence, but you're eliminating all the other distractions, or at least displacing all the other distractions so that you can be alone with that presence. And so at the core of it all, there's an extreme connection. When I go back to Brady's death experience, you know, he's in the blackness, he's alone for all he can tell. And you can correct me, Brady, if I get this a little bit wrong, but in that nothingness, there was no fear in it. And there was extreme sense of connection and extreme sense of caring for it. Did I get that kind of right, Brady?
Yeah, absolutely.
So even though it was a solitary experience, right? But you weren't feeling alone necessarily, were you?
Yeah, the thing that's interesting is if for me, the experience was to be in an egoless state. And so in an egoless state, I couldn't be alone. There was no such thing as alone, because alone is something in contrast to having some kind of individual identity. And so there was no sense of aloneness. There was definitely a sense of being accompanied and in the presence of, but no sense of being alone. That's words that I assigned to the experience after I came out of it, and I began to look for words. You know.
But everybody just think about what Brady just said, and I think this goes right back to the story, the way that the story of the Garden of Eden is portrayed to us. Don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because on that day you will surely die. And it sounds like it's a command. It sounds like it's rebellion. But what's really happening is, and you said it so perfectly, Brady, in an egoless state, it's impossible to feel alone, because in an egoless state, your experience, the connection of everything, it is the ego itself that creates the illusion of separation. On the day that you eat of that tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you die to the unity, you die to the sense of connection, because now you're living within the bubble of your own perceived separate identity. But when we can set that sun, when we can move in that place, then we feel the connection again. And I suppose those who go mad in the desert, or William's friend who was having a psychotic break in the silent retreat is because they're still hanging on to the ego. And to the extent you're doing that, you're in the worst of both worlds. You don't have the context anymore, but you still have the sense of separation. And now you're in a world of hurt. But let go of the sense of separation, and there's the connection. I love the way you put that, Brady. That's good. Is any of this helping, or are we just muddying the waters? I hope it's helping. I hope we're inching closer and closer to the idea here of what contemplation is all about and the benefits of contemplation.
What were we talking about before Brady's comment? Does anybody remember?
Before Brady,
Like somebody said something right before Brady, and I had a thought that I thought might have been helpful. And then
Michael was
Okay.
talking about his
Make it
moments for 40 years in darkness.
oh yeah, we were talking about that, to open up this can of worms, so to speak, can be detrimental. And if you're just alone doing it and you don't have any kind of guide, that you can put yourself into a world of hurt. I think that's where we were leading.
yeah, and I was thinking about when I worked in prisons. You know, you have people who would be in solitary confinement and they go crazy. And then I had other inmates who just absolutely loved it and, you know, had a bit of a spiritual thing going on with their alone time in solitary confinement. So I like your distinction about it's not about being alone, it's about being alone with God, because that makes all the difference.
Yeah, I think I would caution that I do a lot of things to deal with chronic depression, and I don't rely solely on meditation to fix it. You know, I have to exercise, I have to eat right, I have to abstain from drugs and alcohol. I have talked to therapists, I do cognitive behavioral therapy. And on top of all that, you know, I do a daily meditation, but I'm not depending on my meditation to cure my depression. Does that help? Or I'm just afraid, I'd hate for us to put so much weight on meditation that we ignore, you know, some of the other factors that go into chronic depression.
No, and if that's the sense you're all getting, that's not what I'm trying to say. You know, I'm very quick when I'm talking to people about contemplation. This is not a silver bullet. And if you have organic defects and problems, you need to start there. Start with the clinical and move through everything. We're not doing this meditation or contemplative practice in isolation here, not in our lives. And so it's going to be used in tandem with connection with other people and all the things that you're talking about. So yes, we want to be balanced, but what is happening in meditation and centering prayer is we're getting better and better at the technique of being able to step away from that egoic mind and all that noise so that we can bring it through the day in mindfulness, where we're not thinking about nothing, but we're thinking about only the thing that we're actually doing. And we're able to keep that quality, that continuous prayer of Paul going seamlessly through our lives. So yes, it is a combination of things. And yeah, I'm not saying that you can cure your schizophrenia with meditation. It don't work that way, no.
So Dave, would you say that it kind of goes to I forgot what the word you said was for ripeness? You know, does a person kind of have to be in somewhat of a ripened state to manage this, to juggle it, to take it on, it, like John says, in the mix with everything else in your life, rather than somebody who maybe was not very ripe and a little bit off balance or maybe disjointed in some areas of their life? That would be a hard thing to undertake and be able to do it well. So, I mean, in a way, it seems like those who meditate or do contemplative, you know, spiritual work tend to be maybe getting into like a right place in their mind or a ripened place in their life. Maybe like Bill said, maybe it's a certain time of your life that you become this way and, you know, you become more open-hearted about it.
Absolutely. Yeah. You know, when we were working in recovery, we were always saying, hey, if you want to preach the gospel to a starving person, what do? Well, you feed them first. right? And so it's the same thing in recovery. If we want to get people who are in recovery to start to engage in contemplative practice, well, the first thing is we got to detox them. You know, the first thing is we got to get them through the process enough that there's enough balance and emotional regulation that you can even start on something like what we're talking about. So yes, there is I guess there's prerequisite classes, if you want to look at it that way, that we're going to have to take before we can do some of this work. And I think age has something to do with it. You know, how many 20-somethings are really going to engage in contemplative practice? In this culture, not too many. You know, and how many people, you know, what's the mix at the effect? People who are interested in the kind of spirituality that we're trying to teach. Well, take a look around the room. It tends to be late 40s, early 50s and up. You know, it's not going to be the younger people yet because they're in a different space. So yeah, Bill's comment about this time of life, I think, is apt. Absolutely. And what you're saying, Kathy, is true. So there needs to be before you value silence and solitude and stillness, there is a preparation that I think happens.
I will say that every now and again, I come across a bizarre millennial situation where I see a young person who's doing this kind of thing. And I think, oh my gosh, wow, they are so far ahead of where I was when I was 22 or 25, or I was like, how did that happen? I missed so much. And they're doing it early in their life. It's amazing, but it's not very often. I do agree with that. I don't see it very often.
I envy those people. They get an extra 15 or 20 years to maybe actually see things through non-crossed eyes.
I know for me, I started, my grandma gave me a book on yoga when I was 14. And so I started doing the different yoga postures on like a mat in my room. And then it actually included towards the end of the booklet instructions on meditation. And so I think I was 14 or 15 years old, and I would light a candle and meditate on that. And I even had a science project where I had my brother measure my pulse rate while I was meditating. And so I think that may have, you know, to the extent that I was a meditation prodigy, it's possible it was a side effect of my grandma's endorsement of yoga and meditation, but it was very young. So
now here's another thing to also consider. There's meditation and there's meditation. You know, I was talking to somebody just a few days ago and you know, starting to introduce contemplative spirituality because it sounded like he needed it. And yet he said, well, I've been meditating for years. And so I asked him to describe his meditation. But his meditation, his idea of meditation was reading the scriptures. His idea of meditation was listening to sermons. And so the thing that he was doing, and then there was the prayer time, but the prayer time, I said, how do you pray? He was praying with words and praying, you know, so he was keeping his mind active the entire time. In fact, he was reinforcing the egoic mind through what he thought was quiet time and prayer time and meditation. And meditation can be looked at as thinking deeply about something. To contemplate can be thinking deeply about something, but we're using it in a different sense where we're stepping away from that. And some of these apps that are becoming so, you know, ubiquitous these days, but that there's guided imagery and there's stuff that's still keeping your mind active. And so when people talk about those, can I use it? I say, hey, you know, if you'll do that, it's certainly better than nothing, but maybe you can consider that training wheels on the bike. And as you get better and better at that ability to be quiet under those circumstances, start removing the voice, then remove the soundtrack and see if you can back into silence at some point, because we may not be getting the benefits of what we're really talking about here, depending on what we're actually practicing.
I'm glad you just said that, because when Kathy spoke earlier, I was thinking of clients I'd worked with who seemed to have the lingo down of this spiritual whatever. But I know it's not real because, or I think it's not real, or I'm judging it to not be real. But because it's like this, like the histrionics and all of these, emotional roller coaster things are still there. And I think Russ Hudson talked about the difference between somebody who is deeply in touch with their heart and they function from a deep place of functioning compared to somebody who is just sensitive. And they think they're very in touch with their hearts, but they're really just more histrionic than being emotional, if you can make that distinction. So yeah, I see a lot of the young people who they dress the lingo, they have the tattoos of the yin and yang and so on and so forth, and but it's part of an egoic presentation, basically.
Yeah, and it's not to say that type of meditation isn't helpful. It can be relaxing, it can be centering, it can be a lot of things, but it's not really approaching what we're talking about here. And so it's, it's becoming vogue, obviously, mindfulness and all these
Right.
apps, but yeah, what are we really doing? I love the line that Merton said about some people going into the monastery and trying to make contemplative faces at themselves in the mirror. You get that? I love that. It just so captures what we're talking about here. Are you really doing it, or are you trying to look good, in some spiritual sense? But there's a difference. What's that, Kathy?
Dressing the part.
Dressing the part. Yeah, absolutely. So,
Days
all
are-
right, well,
Good looking contemplative over there.
yeah. Making contemplative faces at yourself in the mirror. I just thought that was brilliant, just brilliant. Okay, we're at the end of our time, guys. Thanks again for the discussion. I hope that this is working. If for any of you this just seems like navel gazing and completely off the mark, please let me know, and we'll see what we can do to. I always want to keep this grounded, but I also really want to try to make these distinctions so that as we continue to try to engage contemplative practice, we really do have the X over the treasure and we're digging in the right spot. It's just important. All right, Scotty, can you close us with prayer, buddy?
Sure. Father God, thank you for your love. Thank you for your understanding of who you created us to be and your desire to interact with us and play this game out. We want to get the knowledge and get the connections that we are set up to have, Lord. We don't want to miss them. So whether it's through silent contemplation, active listening, whatever methodology you use through the Holy Word, we just want to thank you for it in advance, Lord, and say, guide us and direct us and protect us. Help us to really get the most benefit out of this so that we can put it to use in our lives and benefit not only ourselves, but those we interact with on a day-to-day basis, whether it's family, friends, coworkers, or the stranger we pass by on the street. Help us to love like you love. We ask all this and we give our thanks and pray it all in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks. Good night.
Another
Good
good
night,
evening.
guys.
Thank you, everyone.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Bye,
Good night.
Kathy.
Teaching me how to blur the background. That was great.
I want a blurred background. I can't have one.
Bye, everyone.
Goodbye.
Night.
Good night, everybody.
Bye,
Good night, Sherry.
Sherry. Good night.
Okay, sweetie. Good night, Frank. Oh, he gone. All right. Bye, Jordana. Bye, Linda.
See you guys on Sunday.
See you guys on Sunday.